So, Lone Rider here, and I want to talk about the issue of mountain biking access at Watchung. Um, I was part of an effort to try and get mountain biking access there and in Union County, New Jersey generally, from 2014 through 2016/17. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was briefly why this was bigger than just mountain biking and why you should care about it if you're not a cyclist. A lot of narrow niche issues. You know, if you're a fisherman, you care about issues related to the water. If you're a hiker, you care about issues related to hiking. If you're a mountain biker, you care about, cycling related stuff. Um, a lot of people outside of these fields don't really pay much attention to what's going on in them. And the thing about the issue of mountain biking access at Watchung is it was never about mountain biking. It was actually about how the government conducted itself. The ban on mountain biking was created by the unelected in a back room without any public input or knowledge at the time. And it's been in place for 20 years. In fact, after nearly a quarter century of being in place, it was arbitrarily expanded from being just about Watchung to every county park in the county of Union County, New Jersey. So back in 2016, when they put up new no bike signs, they didn't just put them back at Watchung where they had been before. They put them at all other county parks, effectively creating new trail closures. And the fact that the decision to ban mountain biking was done behind closed doors, the fact that they repurposed an old ordinance from 1983, which was about roads, paths, sidewalks, and not blocking cars, that they've been saying for years contained the word trail and referred to mountain biking on the trails, but didn't even contain the word trail and was clearly about other stuff. And then that was never specifically linked by name. I mean, they've been talking about an old ordinance that forbade mountain biking on the trails, but when they finally came out and said which one it was for the first time ever in 2014, in one of my follow-up Open Public Record Act requests, as I was trying to get to the bottom of the history of the ban so that I could better oppose it, they finally said which ordinance it was, and turns out it never said what they've been saying for 20 years it said. Now, someone might hem and haw over semantics and say, well, does paths and sidewalks really mean trails? I think we can both conclude that, especially when you're talking about mountain biking, it doesn't. But the point is that if it did, and that's how you're going to defend them misquoting this ordinance for 20 years, then why bother to misquote it at all? If paths and sidewalks really meant trails, why say trails when that word isn't in the ordinance? Why not just say paths and sidewalks? I think the answer is obvious. And then the fact that although they were saying there was an old ordinance that forbade riding on the trails in the park, going back years to the 1990s, they never ever said which one. And the first time, this ordinance from 1983 that allegedly authorized, according to the government, the backroom ban created by the unelected behind closed doors in 1995, the first time this was ever linked to that ban was in 2014. So the ordinance is from 1983. The ban is from 1995, but the first time that ordinance was ever specifically linked in writing to that ban was over 20 years later. And, the more you dig into this, I kind of liken it to a crab cake. The deeper you dig below the surface, the fishier it gets. And there's really no upside for the government in terms of looking at their conduct. Everything comes out as being fishy, as not being above board, as being, questionable or suspicious or something that makes you scratch your head and say, wait a minute, this happened in America? Like, for 20 years, the government was telling people that something was illegal and it wasn't. And then you have the fact that, it took 20 years for somebody, namely myself, to come along and file a series of Open Public Record Act requests and ask the county government, well, so this ban, what's the legal authority for it? What does the legislation actually say? I can't believe that nobody ever asked that before. Um, but apparently that's what happened. And, it says a lot about what happens when you don't have an informed citizenry, when the media doesn't do their job, when the government is behaving in a questionable manner. And the fact that the entire thing was done essentially in an end run around the electoral process. Way back in 1983, the freeholders passed some ordinance about something. Was it about paths and sidewalks, which are the words that actually went into it, or was it really intended to outlaw mountain biking? We don't know. We only know what the ordinance says. Um, but sometime later, over 10 years later, in 1995, a bunch of unelected people came along and decided to reinterpret what that ordinance said, although they never really leaned on that ordinance again in writing until 2014. In fact, way back in February of 2015, we had a meeting, the first of many, with both officials from the county government and representative of CME Associates, the contractor they had hired to design a new trail plan, which we were repeatedly promised would include mountain biking. This was after 3 years of stalling, the promised mountain bike access failed to materialize. But nobody at that meeting ever said, when we were talking about implementing mountain biking access, oh wait, we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're going to have to change a law or an ordinance in order to make this legal because currently it's illegal. Nobody ever mentioned that. The first time anybody really mentioned that at all, again, was in 2014, a year earlier, or a little less than a year earlier, in my Open Record Act request. But then it was never mentioned again for several years. It was almost as if they didn't even believe their own guff. And then in 2016, at an October meeting at the Trailside Center in Watchung Reservation, Mr. Zuber from the Parks Department got up there and basically said, all those people who are complaining that it's taking so long to allow bike access, you have to understand we can't just arbitrarily suspend enforcement of an ordinance. They're going to have to change the legislation. And then he came out and he said, and I have no idea where anybody got the idea that there was no actual law in the books or ordinance on the books banning mountain biking. Well, I hope where people got that idea was from the efforts of myself and other cyclists who were looking at the government's own Open Public Record Act response and trying to extrapolate the truth about what happened 20 years ago. And that's ultimately what this was about at the end of the day. Like, why should anybody care that the government extra legally, behind everybody's back, banned mountain biking and then tried to reinterpret some old ordinance about one thing to say another 20 years after the fact? Why should anybody care? It's just about riding your bike in the park, right? Well, see, here's the thing. It's not, okay? It's about how your government conducts itself, all right? The purpose of having elected legislative officials, whether it's congressmen at the federal level or whether it's freeholders at the county level here in New Jersey, is that you have some say indirectly in what it is your government's doing. If those people can pass legislation, whether it's a law or an ordinance, only to have the meaning of that turned on its head 20 years after the fact by a bunch of unelected goons in a backroom meeting without any public knowledge or input, behind closed doors, then essentially why do we even bother having legislators? Why do we even bother voting? Why do we even bother having the system of government we have in this country where, going back to the founders of the nation, there was a general principle that, government is conducted with the consent of the governed. So the issues at stake were very significant, way more significant than the idea of being able to ride your bike in the park or not. And I think part of the problem is a lot of people never train themselves to think in terms of principles. A lot of people never taught themselves to see, as the old saying goes, the forest for the trees. And so we ended up with a situation where, for most people, it was just about mountain biking. Do you like mountain biking or not? Do you want to share the trails with mountain bikes or not? Nobody ever really thought that. The truth is, this wasn't about mountain biking. This was about the government's ban on mountain biking and everything that entailed, including how it was implemented and how the government conducted itself. And that, I think, was one of the reasons why the effort for mountain biking access ultimately fell through. because we never made it a moral issue. I tried to get people to see it in terms of basic principles about the relationship between the government and the citizen. But even other cyclists, I don't think we're prepared to think in those terms. We're prepared to see the world as what it is, a place where ideas matter and principles have consequences. So instead, something that started off with catchphrases like free Watchung and mountain biking is not a crime ended up being about, is mountain biking a good idea or not? And the irony is, by making it about mountain biking rather than the government's ban on mountain biking and everything that went into that, including how the government conducted itself, which was essentially an end run around the electoral process, the government never had to justify its ban because they put the onus on the mountain bikers. Explain to us, they repeatedly said, why you should be allowed to ride. Explain to us why mountain biking is safe. Explain to us how you're not going to damage the park. Never mind that there was never any documentation, according to the government's own Open Public Record Act responses, of the conditions at Watchung one way or the other, including a single instance of trail damage, user conflict, or injury due to mountain bikes. They very successfully made the issue about mountain biking. And it was because we were unable, really, to make it about what it should have been about, which is the government and its policies and how they were arrived at. So that's where the issue sits to this day. And, when I pick up the newspaper and I read about government here in Union County, in New Jersey, it's in the back of my mind every time that these same people are still in charge and they're still conducting themselves in the same manner. Do you really think that a government that's going to lie to you for 20 years about something mundane like riding your bike in a park being illegal when it's not, do you really think that they're going to be forthright and above board on other issues, maybe issues that you care about? No. This was never about mountain biking. It was about the government's ban on mountain biking and how it was arrived at, which means essentially it was about the government and its conduct and how that reflects on the idea of the relationship between the government and the citizen and how that relationship should be conducted. And it's clear that, according to the government of Union County, basically they're accountable to no one. They're entitled to do end runs around the electoral process. And as far as they're concerned, there's no point in even having a legislature or even voting because they can just change laws or legislation after the fact 2 decades on. It doesn't matter what the law says. They'll just change what it means. Now, here's my problem, which is where, as citizens of Union County, New Jersey, where do we go from here? I think people have to realize what this was about. This was a 3-year-long example of how the government at the county level cannot be trusted. And it's not just the particular people. You could say, well, it was Chairman Bergen, it was this person, it was that person. You know what? The word they broke when they promised repeatedly for 3 years to allow mountain biking access, including voting to approve a trail plan that included mountain biking access, admitting at the February 2015 meeting that, quote, what happened years ago was wrong, unquote. Chairman Bergen himself saying, quote, mountain biking access is the right thing to do, unquote, at a stenographed and videotaped public freeholder meeting. I could go on, but, these people repeatedly promised trail access up to and including amending the contract with CME Associates to pay them tens of thousands of dollars in taxpayers' money extra, specifically for the mountain bike part of the trail plan. Those same people then sponsored a vote to cancel the mountain bike part of the trail plan and strip all mention of mountain biking from it. But they never re-amended the contract. So their buddy, the contractor CME Associates, gets to presumably get paid for work they're never going to have to do. This is pretty bad. And this is essentially the government that we're living with. And we're living with it because we haven't confronted it. We're existing in this situation because we're unable to see the parameters of the situation enough to challenge it. It's too easy to just look at something like this and say, well, it's just about mountain biking. Who cares? That's short-sighted. that's not only short-sighted, that's literally myopic. Okay. Um, if you want to have a conversation about mountain bike access and should it be allowed, that's great. Let's talk about that. But you can't do it while defending the existing ban. If you want to talk about mountain biking, that's a separate issue from the current ban on mountain biking and how it came to be. Because that issue isn't about mountain biking at all. That issue is about the government's conduct and how it conducted itself. And it's basically conducting itself like the three branches of government are me, myself, and I. Again, the whole point of when you have people do something in a backroom meeting behind closed doors without any public knowledge or input, it's not because they're proud of what they're doing and it can stand public scrutiny. Indeed, you could argue the whole point is to essentially do this in an end run around the electoral process. And it leads people like me to look at it and say, well then why even have a legislative branch at the county level? Why even have freeholders whom we vote for? It's not like, if they pass a law or anything, that's going to actually mean something if the government can just 10, 20 years later come in and change what that ordinance means arbitrarily in a back room without any public input. This is the real issue here. This was never about mountain biking. This was about the government's ban on mountain biking and how the government conducted itself. And, the word that the government broke, whether it was Freeholder Chairman Bergen or other government people, when they were promised repeatedly to allow mountain biking access and that it was going to go forward and then it didn't. The word that they broke was not theirs as private individuals. It was the word of the government. So even if those people are gone in a few years, if new people sit in their chairs, the trust and the credibility in Union County government has been irreparably damaged. Okay, because we have a 3-year example, several years of the government clearly saying one thing and then doing another, and the damage that's been done is, they didn't break their own word. They broke their word as government officials. So the reputation that's been tarnished, the damage that's been done to the trust in Union County, it's not damage that's been done to the trust in, let's say, Chairman Bergen. I don't give a crap about Chairman Bergen. It's the damage that's been done to the position of Chairman of the Freeholder Board, all right? Because he wasn't speaking as Chairman Bergen, private citizen. He was speaking as Chairman Bergen, Chairman of the Union County Board of Freeholders, okay? And, it's one thing when you hear in the newspaper about somebody telling a lie or a fib or a tall tale or a stretcher. It's another thing when you have people over the course of several years sit across from you, looking at you from 10 feet away in the eye and lying to your face, okay? This is what the government does, at least at the county level in New Jersey. And I have to be honest, I'm very skeptical that at other levels the government's any more honest, whether you're talking the state level, the federal level, etc. I think there's a culture of corruption, to use a phrase. And that's what this was really about. It was never about mountain biking and the validity of mountain biking and was mountain biking good or bad or do you like mountain biking. Even if you hate mountain biking, okay, you should hate crooked government more. If you want to have a debate about whether or not we should allow mountain biking in Union County, New Jersey, that's great. Let's have that debate. But let's start by admitting that the current government policy is wrong. The way it was enacted was wrong. And you want to debate mountain biking? Fine. Start with a blank slate. Don't start by blindly endorsing a current policy just because you happen to like where it falls according to your own biases. Because what you're endorsing isn't just the idea of banning mountain biking. You're endorsing everything that went into that in this particular example, including how it was achieved. And it was achieved in an end run around our electoral process, in secret, without any public input, by deceiving the public for over 2 decades. And, if you think people who will conduct themselves in that manner on a relatively mundane issue like bike access won't use essentially the same process to conduct government on more serious issues, you're wrong, okay? This is what they do. This is how they act. I mean, if this is how they're going to impose a ban on mountain biking, what makes you think how they would impose any other policy is any different? Right? What have they done to convince you that they can be trusted? Instead, we have 20 years of knowing that they can't be trusted, and then the last 2 or 3 years in particular. So, this was never about mountain biking. And why should you care if you don't mountain bike, or maybe you even hate mountain bikers? Maybe you're one of those people who thinks mountain bikers are all assholes. You know what? If that's your opinion about mountain bikers, you're entitled to it. But again, this was never about mountain bikers. This is about the government and what it has done. We know that the government never documented the situation about mountain biking one way or the other. Subjectively, yes, some people remember bad experiences with a handful of bad apple mountain bikers 20 years ago. How accurate are those remembrances? How much are they colored by bias? I don't know. I mean, I was riding there as a teenager, and I remember everything being hunky-dory. So, whereas other people say it was like, anarchy. So, obviously there's a difference in perspective and a difference in subjective memory, which is kind of why, if you're going to talk about what government policy should be, you can't go by what somebody subjectively remembers may or may not have happened one day 20 years ago. You kind of have to go by what was documented at the time. And according to the government's own responses and Open Public Record Act requests, they never documented a damn thing about mountain biking or the conditions in the park at Watchung one way or the other. In fact, they had so little documentation when I kept pressing them for it, because they kept saying, well, mountain bikes were causing a problem. And I kept saying, well, on what are you basing that? They finally came up with a trail study, the Jonathan Forsell land use study, that was done of 2 trails in another park in another county a year after the decision to ban us at Watchung. This study not only said nothing about the conditions at Watchung and mountain biking there one way or the other, because it was done somewhere else in another park in another county, it didn't exist at the time the government decided to ban us. I mean, it's stamped on the cover in big letters, received April 31st, 1996. Well, the decision to ban us was from the spring of 1995. So it's not only not about Watchung, it didn't exist at the time they decided to ban mountain biking at Watchung. That's what they present as their piece de resistance of documentation about a problem with mountain biking. Seriously? That's the type of thing we're dealing with. That's the type of dishonesty we're dealing with. As far as anybody knows, as far as was documented, there's no proof that there was a single problem with mountain biking at Watchung. Yes, we know people have subjective memories of problems here, problems there, just like other people have subjective memories of everything being fine. But if you go by what was documented, they don't have a damn thing. We don't know for sure, one way or the other, what happened with mountain biking at Watchung 20 years ago, beyond what each of us subjectively remembers, which can't be verified or proven. However, what do we know? We may not know what happened specifically with mountain biking at Watchung 20 years ago, but we do know that in the intervening 20 years, and in particular the last handful of years, the government has lied to, inveigled, obfuscated, and misled the public. That's what we do know. We don't know what the heck was going on with mountain biking 20 years ago, but we do know that, well, the government has been conducting itself in a manner that's less than above board. And ultimately, again, that's what this was really about. This was never about mountain biking access. This was about how your government makes its decisions and can it be trusted. And, so if you don't like mountain bikers, or you just are indifferent to the issue, or you don't care one way or the other, you're sitting there and you're like, well, why should I care about mountain biking access? I don't mountain bike. Why the hell should I care? You should care because, well, you're still subject to the laws and the policies of the government, right? Yeah. Well, do you think that the government's going to conduct itself any more differently on other issues? Issues that may matter to you, whether mountain biking does or not? The whole point is that this was never really about mountain biking. This was about the government's policy, how it was arrived at, and how it conducted itself. And the one thing we do know, we don't know one way or the other what was going on with mountain biking, because the government, by its own admission in Open Public Record Act requests, never documented a damn thing. But what we do know, what's beyond refute at this point, is that the government itself cannot be trusted and has conducted themselves in a manner that is far less than above board. So why should this matter to you? If you're not a biker and you don't care about mountain biking or cycling related issues, well, you're a citizen, aren't you? You have to worry about what the government's policies are, don't you? You're affected by them, are you? Yeah. So you should care, okay? You should care how those policies are arrived at, how honest the government is, how trustworthy it is, whether its decisions are made behind closed doors, and whether the government is willing to lie to people for 2 decades about how and why they made those decisions. So, for those people who say, well, why should I care about this issue? I don't mountain bike. The simple answer is, it was never about mountain biking, okay? It was about the conduct of your government. Lone Rider out.